So while the students are moving in, as Bryan showed you, trying to get their lives back together, there are still constant reminders of the murders all around them. Just minutes from campus, as you saw, that's the scene. Just, yards and yards and yards of yellow crime scene tape wrapped around a house that used to be kind of a centerpiece for fun in that community. And that house is going to stay that way, at least for the next few weeks, because the defense has asked that it remain a closed murder scene until February 1st. Investigators were there as recently as Friday. They were taking things out again, including the mattresses, presumably. We think maybe for testing, maybe for preservation purposes, but they tried to cover them up the best they could. Then just a 10-minute drive down the highway, this is the scene, neighboring Pullman, Washington. That's Bryan Kohberger's home at the Steptoe Village Apartments. It's also been a beehive of activity where Kohberger was living on the night of the murders. And of course, the investigators have done a full search inside that apartment. They've hauled out loads and loads of evidence, including a computer tower. But all we know is what we saw with our own eyes, because as I mentioned earlier, the search warrant is sealed. Both the reason for them going in the first place, and then the accounting list of everything they took out. I want to bring in Darren Kavinoky. He's an attorney and the host of the investigation discovery show Deadly Sins. And Chris Anderson is a former detective who has investigated more than 300 homicides. He's the co-host of the investigation discovery show Reasonable Doubt. All right, you guys, I'm glad you're both here. When I saw the reason for the affidavit being sealed, I just thought it was pretty strident. I mean, some of the language made me think, heavens to Betsy. I mean, I've seen search warrants sealed before, and it says we want to preserve the investigation, period, on a story. But they used this language that was, prematurely end the investigation, threat to public safety. Darren, I'm going to start with you. As the lawyer, what do you make of that language?
Well, I think the threat to public safety is the idea that if they release the affidavit and the items that were actually seized, that it could compromise the investigation, and that the individual that everybody is so confident actually committed the crime may be able to dodge a bullet as a result, that the integrity of the investigation would somehow be threatened. Although I hate to take the wind out of anybody's sails, but I'll just remind folks that are feeling this sense of relief as they go back to school that an arrest is not the same as a conviction. And there's a very different standard of proof that's involved. And of course, that's one of the fundamental reasons why that the information concerning the search warrant is kept under wraps.
So, Chris, jump in on the fact that this is neighboring Pullman, Washington. It's another state altogether. And I get it. Mm-hmm. Police work together. They work in tandem. The FBI was working with the state, was working with Moscow. But now you're in another state. Was this a request made by the teams that are working, the prosecutor possibly, in Idaho of the Pullman police? And would they play in the sand this well? Would they instantly acquiesce to any request that might be made?
Absolutely. Look, there is information that suggests that the defendant in this case is actually guilty. No police department wants to be the cause of any disruption in the investigation. So they are going to do everything that's asked of them to not release information, to not say too much about what was found or what they did, because it only goes to help the defendant and his defense in this case. So, yeah, I could see them not wanting to say anything.
Sometimes it's a tip your hand thing. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But first, I want to read a second part of why the reason was given to keep this all under seal, because this one really piqued my interest, Darren. I'm going to quote, "The personal privacy interests of the witnesses, victims, and victims' families named in the application also support sealing the documents filed in this matter." Look, I always feel for victims, Darren, but the personal privacy of the witnesses, victims, and victims' families, I'm trying to figure out what that means. What was in that apartment that might affect the witnesses and the victims' families? I mean, I've got visions of like flow charts of who's going to get murdered next and when they shower and when, you know what I mean? Like that's what my mind goes to. Is that too much?
Well, no, it's not too much. I mean, that's the kind of obviously very compelling evidence that law enforcement officers hope to discover in this guy's apartment would be evidence that he planned or participated in other crimes. But in terms of the language that you're pointing to, I think about the victims here, and oftentimes victims make certain lifestyle choices that could subject them to public criticism. There could be private medical information that you just generally, out of decorum, don't want that information released to the public. And let's keep in mind that what's really, really vital here is for law enforcement officers to maintain the integrity of their information. And you mentioned it earlier about how reporters are looking for people to talk to and how they would just glom onto somebody. Well, if there's, say, a confidential informant, somebody who gave information to law enforcement to help justify the issuance of that search warrant, you don't want that person being identified. You don't want to send the media out there to start doing their investigation or getting quotes from that person, because frankly, the more statements that are made to the public by a potential witness in the case, the more opportunity there is to develop information that a good defense lawyer can use in cross-examination. So it may just be about the integrity of the evidence, and obviously for reasons of decorum, to protect the privacy of the tragic victim.
That is where I come in on the decorum, because Chris Anderson, as a detective, when you read these, and I'm going to read it again, because every time I read it, I get a different vision in my head of what's in the apartment. The personal privacy interests of the witnesses, the victims, and the victims' families. What on earth does your mind go to about what's in Bryan Kohberger's apartment when you're talking about the witnesses in this case, the victims, and the victims' families?
It could be a list of that we could talk about forever. But there has. It would suggest to me that there is something of grave importance in this investigation. So keeping that portion of the investigation sealed is probably a plot for the prosecution in this case. So yeah, So
can I ask you this? Because you've been there, right? Chris, you've been there. You've done these investigations. If we're looking at the man that committed these murders, if it's him, mm-hmm. and if he did, as the affidavit points out for the arrest of Bryan Kohberger, that he was there 12 times, and much of it was at night. It's entirely possible he was taking pictures through the windows constantly, and that those pictures are up on walls somewhere, and he's fixated on these victims. But that said, I could understand not releasing the photos, but saying that there's a collection of photos. Why, Chris Anderson, would the notion that there might even be photos, or there might even be flowcharts, or a list of victims' names or potential victims in the future? Why would that be something you'd have to? You don't have to say the names, but you could certainly say the nature of the evidence, couldn't you?
Well, yeah, but look, this is a classic circumstantial case, and by no means has this man, is there enough evidence in this case to convict this man. So this is still an ongoing investigation, and I think it may be in the best interest of the prosecution and for the public, for this person, if there is probable cause that exists that he did commit these very heinous murders, that he should be in jail, and they should continue their investigation, because there is information that's coming in at every step. This investigation is nowhere near closed.
Yeah, I'm always interested to hear. There's still a chance for him to beat the rap, especially when you read all of this, and it just sounds so incredibly incriminating. But you're right. We all covered OJ. We all covered Casey Anthony. So it can always happen. Darren Kavinoky and Chris Anderson, I love talking to you both. And it's been so many years, and you still wow me. Thank you.